This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Well, hello there. Thank you to IHMC and Dr. Ford for having me here. Thank you all for coming. I hope I get a chance to connect with every single person who wants to connect, but if I don't, let me just, okay, good. Can I just say hello to everyone out there? I know. You're connecting. We are connecting. Okay, so I'm going to reset the time here. So I have 50 minutes, so I have some time for questions afterwards. So I'm going to talk about the difference between exercise and movement. And it's important, why it's important, both for science to make progress, but also just for how we live our everyday lives. So I'm going to focus on how we live our everyday lives for time's sake. But we are currently experiencing unprecedented sedentarism. I mean, not just this moment right now, but in general, unprecedented, meaning over the human timeline, we've never been as sedentary as we are right now. So I would say it's fine with me if you want to squirm in your seat. That I, Katy Bowman, do not think that it's rude if you need to adjust your position or get up or stand up. So you can feel free to fidget if you would like. Oops, went the wrong way. Okay, so I won't talk too much about evolutionary mismatch theory, but the idea is that our bodies evolved under certain conditions, and movement is one of those conditions. Movement's fairly ubiquitous throughout the human timeline, meaning movement is found in, I think of movement as really the axis or the spine of all human behaviors. If you're talking about everything humans used to have to do to survive, to walk, to bend, to jump, to carry, to dance, to find a mate, all these things were all done through movement. But we live in a time now where really no movement is required through the way that we've shaped our society. So movement isn't required in our particular society, but that change has come about more rapidly, and our body still requires all of those movements. And so mismatch theory is, what are the issues that arise when the environment doesn't match really the very long-term inputs? I think of movement as an input, and I'll talk more about that. So that mismatch theory is the idea of when these inputs are malaligned with the need, there are situations that erupt. And so again, I just want to point out the unprecedented nature of our sedentarism, and also the idea that we've all grown up in a sedentary culture, that we might not even really understand. Like, I know what I think about when I say the term movement. I'm going to say it a lot tonight, but it might be different than what you conjure up in your mind when you hear movement. And so I go around speaking quite a bit to get all that is movement to kind of start filling in what you think of movement when you hear. Because when you hear the term movement, most of you are probably thinking exercise. Not you. I know, I shook your head, no, but for many people, maybe not anyone who hasn't read any of my books or read anything that I've read, it's like, I know, who's heard they need to move more? I mean, yeah, I mean, again, that recommendation is kind of like a blanket. I know I need to move more, but we think usually that means I need to exercise more. I need to be exercising more days per week or more minutes per day. We're still really thinking about that exercise model. But very quickly, I just want to talk about, like, if movement used to be ubiquitous, where did it all go? So I just want to do a really brief human timeline. So we have our kind of modern human bodies for the last, I'm just going to throw some general numbers out there, about 100,000 years. And during that time, we were hunter-gatherers. So if you imagine, there are modern hunter-gatherer populations still alive on the planet. So we can get a sense of what daily activities look like if you had to subsist in a wild environment, meaning there's no refrigerator, there's no faucet, there's no smartphones, there's really very little technology. But if you take that period of time, and then we had a slow transition of agriculture over a long period of time where we didn't have to move around so much to get what we needed. We were able to stay put, cultivate larger amounts of food where we were, and then we can fast forward to the Industrial Revolution. I would say that was another marker. I think I am so biased towards movement, I really kind of all my units in my head are about movement. So if we went to another big movement reducer, the Industrial Revolution would be one of those. We could go maybe to the computer age as another one, like the types of movement that change between those was pretty big. And then I would say there's maybe a line of the age of information. So I would say with the addition of browsers and the internet, that became, computers were used differently by society. And then we could go maybe one more that's very new, maybe the last 7 or 8 years, and that would be the handheld. Not just cell phone necessarily, but handheld, like you can mate practically. You can find a mate online, you can find a meal all in the palm of your hand. You can have it brought right to you. That's the reality of where we are right now. So with every one of those steps, with every one of those technologies that we've come up with, there's been a reduction of movement. And so it's easy, like we're at this point, I would say, with technology where we're gonna have to start delineating what we mean by a technology, because the chair that you're sitting in is a technology. Whether or not it's been impactful, I mean, it's definitely been impactful. How it's been impactful is yet to be determined, but the chair isn't really saving you from anything except for if you're sitting there, if the back of your chair were to disappear right now, what would happen? Right, so I call that movement outsourcing, meaning you have all of the equipment, the hardware and the software, almost all of us, to support the torso yourself. But we humans, I would say, are so, we tend strongly towards conserving energy or expending as little energy as possible. And so if you've got the back to your chair, you'll take it. And what happens when you take it is you can expend less energy, but the equipment that you have to deal with supporting your spine, whether or not a back there, it changes over time. And so one of the things I want to point out is most conveniences, they're not actually saving time. They're saving movement. We've framed convenience as something that saves time, but it's most often saved movement. And the reason it hasn't saved time is, bless you, that need for movement is still there. It's just been removed. You can't do it while you're sitting here at this lecture any longer because of the nice back of the chair. So you'll have to maybe go to a class to learn how to hold up your spine, or you'll have to go to an exercise period of time to practice the movements that you would have done were there no chair. If you also think of taking your hips all the way down to the ground and bringing them all the way up, back up to the floor, this period of time that you and I were together, speaking of ideas, sharing ideas, that could be a time where you would be getting the motions, I'll stand up here, the motions to your knees and hips that we now often go to class or therapy to do. You know, like, I can't see, I'll get my body in front of this podium, right? The idea that we would go and do something like this in a class designed just to do something like this, when it's just a natural part of us sitting together and discussing ideas or people being at rest, that's kind of what's happened to movement. It's been slowly made obsolete. And I think of, I'm traveling from Washington State, and you get a rental car and they now have a backup camera. So I talk about movements as kind of becoming extinct. So again, the spinal twist, very big in the physical therapy, exercise science world, is the idea that we have to, you know, move our body in this particular way. But maybe backing up your car was the last natural place that that occurred. And with the invention of the backup camera, so a lot of these are done for, you know, for safety, the idea for safety. But as we add these technologies, there's something lost with each one. So we might be looking at, as the last cars are phased out that don't have that camera, the last wild spinal twists. Okay, so I'd just like to point out something else. And it's the idea that right now we give out exercises like we give out vitamin supplements right now. I don't think, like the reason we take vitamin supplements, dietary supplements, would be they're standing in for the foods that we're not eating, or maybe for the state of the soils producing the foods where those nutrients are no longer available in those foods. But just we understand, I would say, broadly enough, the idea that we supplement dietarily because the diet that we're eating does not contain those pieces, but we understand the source of nutrients is food, right? And ultimately, what's in the soil that organize themselves into becoming food. We understand that we do this with dietary supplements. I do not think that we recognize yet that this is what we're doing with movement. And for those who aren't, we all went to school, most of us went to school probably in a time where the idea of nutrients, vitamins, and minerals, that was put into kindergarten and first grade curriculums. The idea that there's these chemical, they don't call them chemical compounds, but there's chemical compounds that you need to put in to balance. We don't recognize that that was 500 years of identifying the scientific process of looking at pockets of people who ate differently than other groups and seeing that the absence of certain nutrients were the cause of those particular ailments. So just nutrients are always identified in hindsight. They are identified because they are compounds that in their absence, they create really predictable tissue states that I'll call ailments. And that also what makes a nutrient is that if you introduce back that chemical compound, that ailment dissipates or reduces. That's what makes a nutrient. So hopefully in my lifetime, we will be able to recognize movement as a nutrient and in that it has macro and micro elements. That's my particular interest, and I'm not going to talk too much more about it, but I'm going to be referring back to that analogy. It's not really an analogy, but right now it's an analogy at this state of movement as nutrition. So right now, because we're coming from a sedentary culture, we have a sedentary context. We personally haven't experienced very much movement, and this has shown up in literature in the way that it used to be, maybe even 10 years ago, that if you exercise regularly, you were active. So that's like 60 minutes a day, on a good week. And then if you didn't, you were labeled sedentary. So there was two categories. And the difference between them were these 60 minutes. But because our understanding of movement is so new, like we've had 500 years to work out nutrition and we're still working it out. Like it's kind of if you go back and read a lot of the papers at that time, it's not that different than a comment section like on Facebook. It's like there's a lot of back and forth about those types of things. And they just kind of slowly work themselves out. But right now, we understand movement more to be therapeutic than a basic need. We use it, we understand that movement reduces certain symptoms, reduces risk factors. You go to physical therapy to move one particular part of your body so that another part of your body doesn't hurt anymore. We use it as a therapy because we're so isolated. If said another way, it's kind of like we're in a movement drought, but we've always lived in it, so we don't really have that much to compare it to. We don't, to go back, we had those two categories of active and sedentary, but the headlines were like sitting is the new smoking. There was a lot of, hey, you could exercise regularly, but it was this copious amount of sitting around being active that it turned out you couldn't really exercise off sedentarism. I mean, certainly exercising versus not exercising, you fare better health-wise, but mathematically speaking, the percentage between of movement and an exerciser versus a non-exerciser is really, really small. So they started to come up with a new term, which was actively sedentary, which means you exercised for that 4%, but you sat pretty much the rest of the time just like non-exercisers. And then we start to pull in other populations that are much more active throughout the day and more categories that we'll talk about. So I do want to break down the categories because I think the move more message, again, is, like I said, it's out there, we've heard it, but our understanding of movement is not very nuanced, and I don't think we're able to leverage this idea of moving more. And I also don't think that move more now is going to look like the idea of just eat something. If you're malnourished, just eat something. Just you have a calorie issue. it's not very nuanced in the fact of maybe you have enough calories, but you don't have your macronutrients in the right ratio. Or maybe your macronutrients are in the right ratio, but your micronutrients aren't. We keep dialing it in. So we're at the move more stage because we're in a movement drought, but I think we can do better with the data that we have. So physical activity, these are the definitions that are informing the direction that we're taking in movement science. But I do think that they pertain to everyday choices that we make in our lives. So physical activity is any bodily movement produced by skeletal muscles. So I would highlight produced by skeletal muscles that results in energy expenditure, measurable energy expenditure. So that's like how many calories did it utilize? And it's positively related to physical fitness. So those are the conditions on something that make it physical activity. And all definitions are coming from this one particular paper from 1985. Physical fitness is the ability to carry out daily tasks with vigor, alertness, without undue fatigue, with ample energy to enjoy leisure time, and also to meet unforeseen emergencies. This is a definition, but the tests are more like cardiovascular endurance, VO2 max, muscle endurance. So we have tests that measure physical fitness, the physiological benefits, not necessarily the skill, like can you catch something and throw it back and hit a target. So I'm just going to point it out briefly because physical fitness ideally should line up with biological fitness and health, but it's not always. We can have people who are very physically fit who aren't particularly well. And so that's another big hole because really they should be. The reason physical fitness has emerged is because there should be a better alignment between the two. So here's some examples of physical activity. So I just, running a marathon, gardening, standing at your desk, right, instead of sitting, lifting weights. For some example, I put lifting kids because it's contextual for me. I have kids, it's hard. All right, so that's the idea of physical activity. But now I want to talk about exercise because, again, exercise is what most people think of when they hear the word movement or the recommendation to move more. So exercise is physical activity. It's very structured. It's planned, repetitive. It has a final or immediate objective. It's very intention heavy, meaning you're like, I'm going to walk a mile every day. I'm going to do 20 reps of something. You pick the mode, like you pick what you're going to do. You pick how far you're going to go. You pick how long you're going to go. You check it off when you're done. Really important to the concept of exercise is typically when exercise is being done, nothing else is being done but the exercise itself. That's what you're doing. So you can come up with your favorite exercise in your mind. You can flip some tires, do some sprints, go on a treadmill, do some pull-ups in trees, whatever, it doesn't matter. But you're doing it specifically to reap a physical benefit. It could be the set of stretches that you're doing. Maybe someone gave you need to do these 3 stretches for your back every day. But you've really decided what you're going to do, how long you're going to do it, and you know why you're doing it, and it's to be healthy, right? It's to meet some sort of external health objective. But the relationship between the two, exercise is a subset of physical activity. So the reason I like to highlight it like this is because an example, the difference between exercise and physical activity, we could say take a 5-mile bike ride because you want to keep your heart healthy, or you want to keep your hips loose and limber. That's exercise. But if you were to take that exact same 5-mile bike ride to get to work, it can move out of the exercise box into the physical activity box. So intention has a lot to do with it. It's not necessarily what's happening cellularly, what's happening mechanically that makes them different. It's about why you're doing it. And also, when you ride your bike to work, what else is happening? You're getting to work. You're not using another mode of transportation to get to work. There's an ecology that we will probably not get a chance to flesh out. But I space them like this because our capacity to fit in more exercise is limited by all other things you have going on in your life. Your other needs, your relationships, your work that needs to be done, your other non-exercise hobbies. Maybe you have a family. you have other responsibilities, and because movement has been pulled out of those responsibilities, now you have an extra responsibility, which is to add in all-day movement, but you're supposed to get it to fit into an hour, and so it doesn't really work. And so I'm very also interested in adherence. Like I said, unprecedentedly sedentary. We've never had more money going into research to why we need to move than finding the dosage of movement, but it doesn't seem to be increasing the amount of movement. In fact, the amount of movement is still decreasing. So I'm very interested in why that is. And I think it has a lot to do with how we understand movement, is that we've told everyone we need to move more. They think exercise, there's no space for more exercise in many lives, so it doesn't get done. The consequences are invisible until they're not any longer. And so it's just easy to put it off until there's some bigger reason. And then also, I think that if you imagine other physical activity, I just came, like I said, from the West, snow shoveling, carrying, chopping firewood. If you just went back to, I gave all those kind of landmarks, benchmarks really, in the human timeline. Our parents moved more than we did, and our grandparents moved more than we did. There was just a lot more physical labor involved in everyday living. And the complexity of physical activity is usually a lot greater. And that's important, which I'll get to here in a second. So physical activity and exercise, they are understandings of movement that are predominantly related to kcals, or caloric expenditure, which when we started to investigate movement, that's where that point of view was coming from. It's like one of the physical fitness measures is body composition. And so we kind of think that we're supposed to move to keep our body composition in this particular range. And so it really still relates back to kcals, even though the benefits of movement have become much larger. There's bones and nerves and blood flow to the brain and all these other things that don't relate to calories, that don't relate to whole body states. So there's also this phenomenon of you are active or you are sedentary. And I think that now, I'll explain cellular movement here in a second, I think we're extremely limited by the fact that we see ourselves as active or sedentary. It's going to be more nuanced than that. They don't fully represent movement, and I'll give you that definition here in a second. And they currently fail to integrate non-fitness benefits to movement. So if you look at that list of physical fitness benefits, well, at least the tests that we're using to measure how well your body is working in your life, those tests might not be the best possible way to measure physical fitness. So that's why I want to talk about movement. So movement, I tend to think in terms of geometry. That's why I go off on so many tangents. You're welcome. Laughter is also medicine. So it's really a change in shape. We can reduce movement to a change in shape. I like normalizing things for easier assessment. And so since movement is, literally a change in shape, sometimes it can be a change in location, but there usually is changes in shapes that get you to that change in location. If we think about it that way, then we can think about these forces on cells, or at least patches of cells, clusters of cells, a tissue, or an area. So movement is occurring when the cells that make up your body change shape. So mechanotransduction, this right here is how I think movement will eventually be able to be classified as a nutrient. So mechanotransduction is the process by which a cell will sense its change in shape and then translate those mechanical inputs or distortions or movement, however you want to think about it, created by their physical environment into biochemical signals, which allows them to adjust their parts and function based on that information. So when you take a dietary compound, you are changing the behavior of some cells based on that input. This is another input which changes the behavior of the cells. One is a chemical compound, one is a mechanical compounds, not the right word, but they're both inputs, and you are affecting the way that the cells behave through this process of mechanotransduction. So here's how I would organize. Who doesn't love a good Venn diagram? Movement, physical activity, and exercise. So right now, we're really focused on the purple, the smallest of the definitions. And we're trying to find solutions to big problems by looking kind of through a very narrow perspective. So we broadened it out to physical activity. And then I would say that movement is much larger because movement is not bound by the fact that it's skeletal muscle. It's not bound by caloric expenditure. There are many other movements, and when you're calculating a movement mismatch, there's many other variables to movement that are missing from the current model of movement. So we're going to talk about this shape here just a little bit. But before we do, quick reminder, not to get too philosophical. I mean, again, I see this as mathematical. You have a body, but you have a body that is fashioned out of 1 trillion smaller bodies. Both those things are true. Those are your cells. So just a reminder, you already knew it, but just to put it out there on the front of your head. I put this in red. Everything else is very boring, typewriter, black and white, but this is red, so this is like going to be a key takeaway that I think is an important piece of this presentation, which is movement is both a whole body and a local phenomenon. So you can think of local as a part, it can be your arms versus your legs. You could also think of it as an area of cells or just a single cell, but it's both. And right now we are limited by the fact that we've made movement in many cases as a whole body state. You're exercising or you're not exercising. Even though I have some examples to show how we're already thinking outside of that box. But here's another example. And I will say that movement is protective of health. Why it is protective of health is not clear. I believe it's going to end up having something to do with mitochondria, but why it is not clear. So this was a really great study because it was an intra-individual control, meaning the subjects of this test were both the people not doing the exercise and the people doing the exercise by giving this group probably the worst personal training program of all times, which is only use one leg for a very sedentary population doing intense leg extension exercises for 3 months. And they did biopsies of both legs before and biopsies of both legs after. And they found that the training leg, so that would be the leg that did the movement, that there was changes in the DNA methylation. So there's a change in the genetic expression. So when we think of, and it was interesting because this was used as evidence for why we do exercise. It's like, see, we are doing these we're doing this muscle endurance exercise, and we're doing this whole body state, kind of a cardiovascular state exercise, but the part that received the changes that they believed to be protective was not throughout the entire body that had exercised. It was in the parts that had done the exercise. It was in the movement itself. It was localized. Yeah. And so, I got all excited about that because I think that there are whole systemic benefits to movement for sure, but there are also local ones. And so this has a lot to do with how do we pick the mode of movement that we're going to do. If we're trying to move more, if we're aware of parts of our bodies that aren't moving well, is it enough to just take my body on a bike ride if my arms haven't done anything? And I think we already intuitively have seen, without necessarily this evidence, if you do a lot of one type of movement and you're like, oh, I'm running all the time or I'm cycling all the time, but my knees can't handle it any longer, then the recommendation is also often to what? Cross-train, right? So you want to cross-train, you want to add in work some other body parts, because the movement or the health of those parts supports other parts. If you go to a physical therapist, they're usually they're mechanically transducing healthy cells in some angle that when you move like the way that you move, the alignment with which you move isn't meeting the needs of some parts of your body. So they give you kind of a local dose of movement, yeah? We could think about it that way. And so we already understand it, but I don't think it's affected our language or our definitions. It has affected maybe some practice when it comes to athletics and people who are doing a large volume of one type of movement. So if you're a cyclist and you hear move more, you maybe don't need to cycle more, in the same way that if you went to a nutritionist and you said, I already have this healthy diet, but this healthy diet is only involving 2 foods, and they can say, well, no nutrient is really healthy. It's the ratio of everything that makes it. And so there's a ratio to movement that we're already operating in, but we haven't really clarified our language and restated everything that is, I think, keeping some of the progress a little, it's stunting the speed of it a little bit. So this is also, like I said, I've been studying movement for a long time. I love it. If movement is on the part or cellular level, so is sedentarism, right? That's the flip side of it. So the term that I'm using and working to define is cellular sedentarism, that you can be active, you can meet the category of being active, an active person, but you can have spots of sedentary cells. And I think it's important for health outcomes, especially as if you just look through all the literature on which ailments, like I said, are the symptoms are reduced or the risk factors are reduced through movement, they're all across the board, meaning they're all across the body and they're all across the tissues of the body. And so I think that we, in the same way that we could say, well, this part of your body needs to add movement, is to really understand that what we're dealing with is cells that are entirely sedentary, couch potato cells right next to triathlon cells within the same person. I think it would explain quite a bit as we're trying to figure out how movement works. So I would modify move more to move more of your parts. That we're not only thinking of moving more, that we're thinking of moving more of our parts. So because the way we define, we've lost all movements. Not only the fact that you probably didn't walk here, and if you did, forgive me for saying that. Right, yeah, I know. I knew there was going to be I did walk here. That there is so much more. We have, because we've focused on physical fitness, we've lost the benefits of the very small movements that don't qualify under physical fitness. The fact that, where did movement go? I can buy pre-chopped, pre-shredded, pretty much any vegetable. Not only do I not have to grow it, I don't have to walk to the grocery store to get it. I don't have to carry it while I'm walking around in the grocery store. And now I don't even have to cut it. I don't have to wash it. I don't have to do anything. I just have to eat it. And so I kind of say this for laughs. It's like, someone's like, does it really matter if I'm chopping something or grating something? You will not know that until you go to your PT or your OT to learn how to do this again. This is a common therapy, to stretch each finger, right? These small movements do matter, but they don't fit in to the current definitions of movements that we're being given across the board for what movement is. So it's going to be, it already is move more of your parts, but I'm just going to modify the big picture as you're trying to figure out your movement diet. It's like, right, I need to move more, and I need to move more of your parts. Moving more of your parts, though, again, we're going back to movement adherence. I think humans, again, we're trying to conserve energy. It's really hard to go from movement drought to mover. Your whole society is basically telling you to sit down. And so, right, if you stood up right now, it would be perceived as almost rude. That's why I like to say, feel free to stand up and do what you want to do. But you could also be more stealth with move more of your parts. For example, you can be stationary and move more of your parts. And you can do that right now by scooting away from the back of your chair. You can sit differently. You can still even sit. I'm not even saying that you have to stop sitting, but you can stop using the back of your chair just by scooting forward to the front of your chair. Just try it for a second. This would be a good time. There's no time like the present, someone said. So just that, but you can also expect discomfort, right? Like if I told you, just go run 3 miles really fast, you're gonna be like, I can't do it. Well, sitting all day and holding up your torso might require a transition process. So just, I think we understand if you're gonna sign up for a half marathon or a century ride, or you wanna lift something heavy, you know that there's a training program, and I would say that even these subtle movements have a training program for them that can take your body that's adapted to not moving and slowly adapt it to movement through good program design. All right, so we're gonna go back to that picture again. So movement is so much bigger than physical activity because, like I said, it's going to contain more than the movements that fit into the physical activity and exercise time. There's going to be more geometries, there's more tissues involved. Remember, physical activity is limited to musculoskeletal movement. It doesn't say anything about the ciliary muscles in their eyes, which we are experiencing surges in myopia, which means there's muscles within the eyes. It used to be one kid in class, me, who had severe myopia in school, and now, in China, you're seeing upwards of 50 and 60%. You're just seeing more people in glasses. Why? Because the distances that you allow yourself to look are what change the shape of the lens. And as you play with the frequency and distribution to movement, which is going to be other variables that we have to consider, that doesn't fit into physical activity or exercise, but it's movement. It's directly related to movement. The mechanics are the same. Okay, so movement, it occurs on the cellular level. It's not limited to skeletal muscle movement. It can affect the whole body, but it can also affect local parts. And you can define, we can keep taking parts down all the way to the cellular level, and maybe beyond that. It doesn't require an intention. It doesn't require a caloric expenditure. It's simply a change in geometry or location in some cases. So I often get a question, what are some examples of, let me go back here. What are some examples, like if we have these categories, what would go inside the green but not in the blue or the purple? Like what are some concrete examples? So some examples of non-exercise or physical activity movement would be the loads created through posture or positioning, right? So it doesn't, like you're not going to, maybe if you monitored over time, you would see that, like they've found that sitting on an exercise ball, you'll burn 4 calories more per hour, and here's, how, but it's just, it doesn't count in our minds that have really been looking for this higher intensity. So we've kind of thrown away, that doesn't count, that doesn't count, that doesn't count, until we're left like with 45 minutes a day of one thing. So body shapes that are created as you interact with your habitat. So we sit in a chair, right? And then we don't just sit in a chair. The chair, you're not just in a shape and then you're in that shape on a chair. Your chair starts pushing on your tissues and changing, ultimately ends up in many cases changing the tissue, what tissues are there, the tissue type in that area through maybe repetitive stress. I talk a lot about skin. Skin adaptations are one thing. Like we don't have to barely use our hands, and we certainly don't use our hands in tools the way we used to, or natural surfaces, but calluses on our feet and our hands, these are adaptations that change the forces with which we move, but it doesn't, those skin adaptations, which are part of what allows us to move more complexly, they are created through tension and compression on these tissues, but there's no space for them. There's no place for them in current movement models. I talk a lot about, and I will, sitting on the floor. For many people, the pressure of sitting on the floor, you're not used to it. These are, I haven't come up with a good term for how your body gets pushed. Like if you're climbing a tree or you're climbing up on something, or if you're pushing into the ground, your body is displaced. These tissues are pushed. And when we talk about what classifies something as a nutrient. In order for something to be classified as a nutrient, you have to show that a therapy is working to mitigate the symptoms of the loss of the thing. So there are now all sorts of emerging, I would call them pressure therapies, but we would call them massage, fascia work, touch, right? All these tissues that no one has really thought about for a long time because we're still kind of at the easiest to see. With nanotechnology, will be increasing, I would say, what we're contemplating, what we're considering with movement. But there are many pressure therapies because we've kind of cushioned the world. Like you've got cushions in your feet, and you've got cushions for everything that your butt's on. You sleep on a cushion. So we're kind of pressure void so much that we don't have the adaptations for anything. It hurts when someone pushes on us because we've created an environment where nothing pushes on you too hard. And then eventually you have to buy something that does push on you, whether it's a person or a tool or a very firm mattress, right? So we've changed the environment, but then we're starting to bring therapies in to make the environment tolerable, to make us allow us to still move forward in that particular environment. I'm really interested in thermal regulation, horripilation. Horripilation is the fancy word for goosebumps. You've got a muscle, an erector pili, for every hair that you have, and you're raising it and lowering it depending on temperature, also, other things, arousal, being startled in general, but we don't really use those musculature because we can just program the environment that will prevent those movements from happening. But if they're like move it or lose it type of thing, right? Like there's a need for movement in these systems, and as we get rid of the need, then there's going to be some adaptations, and then eventually maybe evolution away from our parts. Distances that you can look to, that was another example. So how far is what you can look? If you're in the back, what's that? 40 feet, 50 feet. But what we're kind of reduced to a lot of time of what's that? 12 inches, right? And so I didn't look at anything like that besides a book. I looked at a book quite a lot. But as it becomes, like I said, more ubiquitous, as it becomes something that's issued at a very young age, there's going to be adaptations because these are all mechanics, because there's a literal mechanical shape that's required to focus on something to a particular distance. And so I think if you only use your bicep through 3 degrees of its range of motion, you would expect a tendon change and a muscle mass change. If you've ever broken your arm and had to spend a summer in a cast, that's a good example of moving your whole body, but having sedentary cells in another place. So I think of a lot of the things that we have are casts, because movement is a response to the environment, and as you change the environment, you change the way you can respond to it. I can't look at something 12 inches of my face and recreate the shape of my eye that comes to looking at a half a mile away. Looking a half a mile away is the condition that we currently have that gets a certain range of motion of my eye. So that might be changeable, but it is going to be an issue for humans who are growing up who have never used the full range of motion of their eye. All right, so these are some examples. And hearing, so many of our senses are simply movement facilitated. Like movement is, like I said, movement is the axis for sensory, for digestion. We've organized our body into systems. There's a hierarchy, but it could be that our understanding or that hierarchy, that classification system is preventing us from unifying the role movement has with our physiology. Okay. So, like I said, why it matters is I'm interested in the scientific understandings of movement. How does movement work? I think that we need to clarify movement, or else we're asking how does physical activity or exercise work? But we're using the word movement in there often. And so exercise and physical activity and movement are not necessarily interchangeable. They have separate definitions, or they should have separate definitions. Are our fitness tests sensitive to non-exercise adaptations? We might need to overhaul some of our fitness tests if physical fitness is to better align with health or wellness. What are the non-fitness benefits to movement? That's part of that process. What is the movement mismatch? If there's a movement mismatch, what is it exactly? We want to have all of the variables. We want to have a 360-degree picture of the thing if we're creating solutions, technologies to mitigate some of the symptoms. In terms of practice, this would be just what you and I do on a daily basis. Is move more adequate? Or do we need to modify that a little bit? How do we convey move more of you? I mean, besides just saying it explicitly. Do we need an exercise prescription, which is what we are focusing on quite a bit? There has been a movement towards more physical activity prescription because the limitations of exercise, especially in populations that don't have extra time or money, that are often the most at risk for lack of movement-related issues or repetitive movement issues, exercise prescriptions don't work for those populations. So what are physical activity prescriptions? Like, don't park in the closest spot to the gym or to the grocery store, or take the stairs. They're like really old and tired, like we've heard it. We don't do it, but we've heard it. Or do we need a movement prescription, right? Do we start changing some of this language here because you're able to fill in much more time and many more body parts when you can transition to a physical activity or a movement prescription. So the Hadza, they're hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, and a lot of the data on what I would call natural human movement, which is what are the movements that it takes to survive now. They're certainly, they're modern people, so they're not ancient relics, I like to say, but they subsist, I think, like on 90% wild food. And so they have really low risk for disease. They've got excellent disease markers, low cardiovascular disease. So they're researched quite a bit for microbiome, diet, and then they've just recently started to add movement. So they fitted them with, I don't know, maybe, I'm gonna say like 45 of them, with heart rate monitors for 4 2-week periods that spanned the year, because they're not doing the same thing throughout the year. It really depends on season and what they're looking for. And they're trying to, I think the premise of this particular paper was looking at, again, through that cardiovascular, the hierarchy of movement has placed cardiovascular exercise really at the top, because I think that the incidence of episodes are so high, we're really just focused on keeping the heart well, and we don't really see the heart as related to the wellness of other parts like your feet and your knees and your hips, even though I would differ. And so the sum total of their average movement was about 220 minutes daily of light activity. So they're measuring heart rate. So it's not particularly challenging, but it's frequent. It's throughout the day, light movement, 115 minutes in moderate and 20 minutes in vigorous. So 135 minutes in moderate to vigorous exercise, which is much higher than what most people get, but also that 135 minutes is also done with 220 other light minutes. Now, this particular paper didn't focus on those minutes very much. Again, they're trying to identify the mismatch. And right now we're working with a fitness model. And so the fitness model, again, prioritizes cardiovascular health. And then I think the thinking is then it's all about the movement of the heart itself. And so this was evidence for why we would want to do 20 minutes of vigorous or 40 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise a day. So that's thinking of movement. I would say it's systemic movement, large scale movement. You're looking at total minutes moved. You're looking at total calories expended. You're looking at intensities. These are things that they're easy to measure. So it's sort of like when we were first, I wasn't there, when people were first starting creating an anatomical model of the human. It's really grouped by the size of what you can see, the ease with which you can see it. We organize, I would say, because we're heavily visually dependent, that's our sensory organ of choice maybe, that the hierarchy becomes what you can see most easily. And what you can't see maybe is a little less significant. And so we tend to focus on these in the field. They're also the easiest, the cheapest to measure. You can use a heart rate monitor. It's like they're very easy. What's more challenging are these, how do you measure local? How do you measure local movement phenomenon in the Hadza? So you would be wanting to look for things like geometrical variance. Yes, this was what their heart rates were throughout the day, but how did they get their heart rate there? Because it's easy to take away that 20 minutes of intense activity is protective, but how you got there might also be part of what's protective. It might not only be what the heart did, it might be what the rest of the body was doing to get the heart to that particular state. So what are the types or modes of movement that got to that state? So this would be how you would think about either your own particular programming, if you were using data, if you're an exercise scientist, how we need to start measuring more than some of the most basic fitness things. So what was interesting is the total minutes moved was 356 minutes, and they measured the intensities. They didn't measure geometrical variance per se. They did list that the types of movements that created the vigorous activity was carrying children, water, and wood, which is different than how many of us would go out to recreate that 20 minutes of intense activity. So this is why it starts to matter how movement works, because we're trying to figure out what to do. How does a sedentary culture dose themselves with movement? So it's like we want to start thinking about, well, carrying something and is much more, it's like could be a low impact. There's different parts of you that have to contract. It distributes movement throughout your body. As anyone who's ever carried a child for 6 miles, you can't use one repetitious position. You have to cycle through positions, which means you're moving more of you during that bout of time. And so this is why we do have the technology at this point just to video and then extrapolate joint positions. It's fairly easy to do. It just is not protocol at this point because we're still kind of stuck in the old fitness measures. We haven't really moved into this part-by-part measure. So this will be the way of the future, I hope. And then, of course, I said I would mention the ecological or larger scale. The purpose of movement is, I think, going to turn out to be very important to adherence. We know that we need to move more, but we're having to kind of manufacture the willpower to move all of the time against, like I said, a sedentary society with, like, how do I explain it? It's almost like there's a momentum towards sedentarism that is creating a vacuum effect. It's a culture. It's the issue of the culture, and even my kids are like, why do we have to walk everywhere? Why can't we just drive? Like, why are we so weird? And they're 6 and 7, but they already feel the difference. And I think of culture as something that's flourishing or growing, just like a culture in a group, and there's a resistance to not replicating in exactly the same way. Whole different phenomenon that I would love to study in my 17th life from now. Okay, how does movement fit into life? So these are going to be, I would say, this is an even larger ecological scale. We have spent so much time, I would say, as a group, not like growing up to think about ecology. It's like we started with the small, and eventually we get to more ecological thinking. And I'm kind of on the reverse. I'd like to start with the ecological thinking, and maybe they're at the same time. You're just constantly comparing your ecological data to your finer details, and you're growing them up at the same time rather than doing one and then the other, because the ecological perspective is going to change all these smaller details anyway. So when I talk about, here, I'll go back here just a second, the purpose or the initiator of movement, like all animals, we are very much shaped by our environment. The features that we have, everything that is us is about the biological pressures of an environment. And we are unprecedentedly sedentary, but we're in shapes and things that are unprecedented as well. Both of these things are happening at the same time. You're moving through an environment, but your environment is moving you right back. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my goodness. Okay, so your habitat is the shapes of what you take rest on or place your body. They're your furniture, they're your shoes. And I'm gonna ask you to rethink all of it, but I'm not gonna give you very many details with which to do that. The shapes of what you walk over. We tend to like make everything flat and level. And I was watching a video of the robot competitions and the robots trying to figure out how to walk on uneven terrain. And I was like, there's humans that can't even do that, which is what I deal with. I deal with the humans that are in the same state as this robot right now, only the robot doesn't have the parts right now to allow particular articulations and leverages. But you do. We do. We are just not using them because we're adapted to a particular situation that disables them. So you need to reintroduce them, even though you have the hardware and the software. You have the hardware and the software, so you're ahead of the robot, but everything's been made flat and easy for you to walk on. And then it becomes very at risk at any time you step on something that moves beneath your foot. So you can choose to walk on the lumpy, bumpy thing next to the walkway that's been human approved, and that's just grass. It's like the stuff that you don't like that. And so you just want to start adding some, mindfully adding in a program that starts to increase the complexity with which you're moving, because that's the only thing that moves the parts that you've got. You've got 33 joints in each foot to allow. That's 66 joints, for those of you who don't like math, that allow for subtle articulations. So if you get an acorn underneath your foot, you don't have to lurch 2 degrees to one side. You can just adapt and move underneath it, unless you have something stiff and flexible on your foot, an exoskeleton, so to speak. And so we have to watch our technologies. Our technologies start as something that can allow you to move or pull out another piece, but sometimes they snowball into non-essentials, or they're essential for a very small situation, and then they become, again, distributed widely. So we just always want to watch to make sure that our choices that we're making are things that better us individually and as a group. All right, I'm going to fast forward to that. So I love a good puzzle. This is think and move outside the exercise box. All right? Movement fits into your life naturally. You do not need to exercise. So rethink your furniture type and distribution. And if I was going to give you a math problem, it would be to go home and calculate the butt to chair ratio of your home. How many butts are in your house and how many seats are there? Because all animals, the movement of all animals is signaled to them by the shape of where they dwell, and vice versa. The shape of the creature informs and shapes the environment, and there's this reciprocity that's going in. So we just kind of get the square, and then the seats in the square, and then the thing, and we just hand them down, but this is a part of, we're handing out casts. We kind of are doling out casts. Rearrange your kitchen. I did this the other day. You put all the stuff that you use all the time in places where you have to barely move to get it. And then I would say you put the Thanksgiving platter in the place where you have to do like a backbend twist, to get on the floor and crawl to get it one time. But you could reverse that. You could add the movement and the rate. You're going and just practicing lifting something that you don't need to lift over your head 30 times. It could just be something that you actually have to lift and put away. So take a couple things that you use daily, put them up high or put them down low. Let your need for your nut butter or your coffee allow movement to happen reflexively, right? You don't have to will it in. Take the stairs, like I said. We know to take the stairs, but the elevator is just so much easier. We just don't have the habit for necessarily do it. Walk the lumps and bumps. Reconsider your footwear. Over time, drive less. Garden, walk to get your groceries, carry things home. All right. Exercise. I love exercise, but I use exercise as a tool to condition your body to get rid of the cast-like baggage. Like I think of all exercise as really rehab. because of a lifetime of sedentarism. So after you're done with the exercise, it's to get to the larger movements. So like a lot of people don't move because they're in pain. They can't move. And so we're going to use exercise instead of just pursuing the general categories of exercise. We're going to use corrective exercise so that we can have access to all of our parts and levers so that you can take to more complex motions. So you exercise to meet any movement nutrients that you might not be able to work into your day. There's certainly, I would say, like I said, we don't know what the exercise nutrients are. I have a list of them in my mind and on paper, but I won't share them today. But there's some that I can't fit into my life. I don't have a ton of carrying things uphill and the ankle motion and the particular extensions that creates. So I have to go find hills and I take those as my exercise. But I exercise to meet the needs that I can't fit into my everyday. And I don't exercise anymore on the things that I can. I walked here so that I don't have to do walking on a treadmill. All right, so science is part of a culture, and how science is done largely depends on the culture in which it is practiced. And so I just put this quote here because we are a sedentary culture, and it's affecting how we're researching movement. So we have to almost get moving before we can see the holes, just like everything else. But I just like to point it out that part of the assumptions we need to list is that we're sedentary, and we don't really know that much about movement as we're investigating it. All right, nutritious movement, that's me. Thank you. Thank you. Woo! Holy cow. I have negative 1 minute and 20 seconds for questions. Yes.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
You mentioned a microbiome quickly, and we know that 80% of the immune system is in the gut. And do you know of any specific exercise to make the microbiome or the healthy gut bacteria stronger?
Ooh. I don't. I'm trying to pull a piece of data out of my head that's in there deep. I would say that there's something that's calling to me that's about maybe, is it spinal motility? No. I'm just confusing two things in my head. I would say that there is an indication of exercise versus non-exercise and the effect of the microbiome, but why is not clear. Right now, I think the hypothesis is you change your energetic demands when you exercise versus don't exercise, and that could be affecting the microbiome. The other thing that I would look at be more interested in would be, does the mobility of a particular area affect the motility of the intestinal tract, which would then revert back to that. So I don't know. I don't know is pretty much the answer to all the questions you're going to ask me. Just letting you know ahead of time. Yes?
I was just going to say belly dancing.
Oh, belly dancing? All right. Belly dancing. Oh, am I supposed to pick? I thought you were going to throw it. Throw it and catch it.
Thank you. So looking at the hunter-gatherer tribes, and once their children move from infant to the toddler and start moving around, are they still carrying them a lot, or are they letting them walk and move on their own? Because it seems like if movement in adults causes genes to turn on, it seems like the same thing would happen in children as well.
So just, I would say that, I am saying it, so that's how you know. Carrying children is part of, it introduces much more movement versus tying or strollering kids. So I would say that hunter-gatherer children, and that's a particular interest of mine, are already moving more because I read once the terminology was like container-free, that they're container-free, so to speak. So they are moving more. And there's one paper that actually did what I said I wish more papers would do, which would be to measure all of the unique movements. This wasn't hunter-gatherer. I believe it was like just Mali. There was an indigenous population in Mali somewhere. They weren't necessarily hunter-gatherers, but they had something like 100 more movements, daily movements, reaching, holding on, more clambering, and this is still in the infant stage, than the infants that were under Western practices. And so I think that there's more movement there in general. What that movement is exactly, it hasn't been teased out. I do think, so there's a, like they walk more because they're just with a walking people that moves more, but it's also riskier, so they're actually maybe carried longer. But again, so I didn't do any containers with my kids, so I taught them how to hold on themselves. So they are still, they are on my back, or are they still because they just had to do a 15-minute flexed hang. So there's not even language to really even flesh out some of these ideas yet, because there's not really language for, I mean, I could talk about the cells and the angles. I want to reduce everything to the math of it. But yeah, I would say that hunter-gatherer children are much more mobile and in complex situations and in unshod situations, which is why it's so risky for those first 5 years. But after they get to it, past those 5 years, then their strength is much more suitable for the environment in which they're in.
Time for one more question.
Okay, thank you.
Right
Anywhere.
behind you,
Sure.
Michelle. Oh, two more.
Oh, excuse me. In the Northwest, it's been my experience, I work with a lot of software companies in Seattle and Silicon Valley, and I'm sure you've seen the huge rooms with programmers sitting all day. Some of the largest companies I deal with, have huge gyms. Gyms are somewhat empty. And these guys are working all day, nonstop, and I was just curious about that, if you had a comment about that. And then in Tanzania and Kenya, one thing I noticed is a lot of the guys that are out there walking, they're not really hunters and gatherers. They progressed into cattle, following the cattle and protecting the homestead. But they're wearing interesting shoes made out of rubber tires. I don't know if you've experienced that. Versus Nikes, the majority of them are using rubber tires, and I wonder if that gives them a better ability in their environment. And the other thing is, have you talked about putting a Fitbit on any of them for studies?
That's 3 questions. So the first question is, well, yeah, it was more like, yeah, there's a lot of people sitting down right next to huge corporate fitness centers. People aren't really using corporate fitness centers. Right, so there's been a change to actually bring the corporate fitness center to where you're actually working, right? So you can just move. So there's definitely a trend. People are trying to figure out how to get more movement while also being still and producing. Second thing, yes, so shoes are technology. So I would say that there are many groups that have figured out different types of shoes to wear that provide a little bit of protection or desensitization that allows so much more, maybe even reductions in injuries and things like that. And tires are nice and flexible, aren't they? Maybe they affect some other input, but moccasins have been around for 8,000 years. I mean, we've worn shoes and made shoes out of whatever is in the environment for a long period of time, but they're pretty unstructured. So again, there could be a delineation of shoes based on the mobility it does or does not offer in lots of different planes, which is how I categorize footwear. And then I don't remember what the third question was. Fitbit. Fitbit, what?
To monitor movement and,
Well, I think that my interest in movement is on the part level. There's so much data already on the whole body level. I don't know if we need any more data on the whole body level. There are so many more interesting, unexplored, we'll call them galaxies of movement that we haven't even put our eyes over there to look at, that I am really focused on for my work, bringing those out to light so they can be explored by many other people for many years to come.
I was raised on a farm and walked 2.5 miles each way to school, and a lot of things go on.
Yep.
And I wondered, would it be a good thing to just do away with these damn expensive school buses?
Walking school buses are a thing. Walking school buses are a thing. Start one in your area. Okay. Is
On
that
that
it?
note, let's thank our speaker.